Good evening. Thank you all for coming tonight. I'm Stephen Pugnani. I'm head of marketing here at the Institute of Science. And I'd like to thank you all for coming to the second of our series, What's So Great About the Great Lakes. We're very excited about this series, partnership between Cranbrook Institute of Science, the Water Forum at Cranbrook Institute of Science, and the Nature Conservancy. We've had a wonderful response to this lecture. Most of you have bought the series, so thank you. We'll be seeing you again. I already see some faces from last time. I'd like to thank, before we begin, our sponsor, Northern Trust, for helping defer some of the costs for this program, and our media partner, Michigan Public Radio. Support like that is always very helpful and only adds to the richness of this event. Our speaker tonight, Jon Fosgitt, is the co-owner of Compass Land Consultants, Inc. Jon has been a private consulting forester in Michigan's Upper Peninsula since the year 2000. He is currently co-owner of Compass Land Consultants, Inc. CLC is a progressive land management consulting firm with over 20 employees and 3 offices in Michigan and Wisconsin. Compass currently manages 255,000 acres of FSC certified lands for the Nature Conservancy and the Forest Land Group. I did a little math today. I'm not very good at math, but that's about half the size of Oakland County, so that's a good chunk of land. In addition to providing forest management services, CLC has a robust forest land appraisal business. And the team frequently helps institutional investors, governmental agencies, and private industry on a wide variety of valuation and acquisition projects nationwide. Prior to working in the private sector, Jon worked in the paper industry as a procurement forester after graduating from Michigan Tech with a BS in forestry. Tonight, Jon will be talking about seeing the forest for the trees. So, welcome, Jon.
Okay, well, thank you for that wonderful introduction. A little bit more about my relationship with the Nature Conservancy. As you mentioned, I own a private business. I'm a consulting forester. But I've had a relationship with the Nature Conservancy for about 8 years since they acquired the Two-Hearted River Forest Reserve. Since that time, we've worked with the Nature Conservancy on developing a management plan for that property, obtaining FSC certification, and we've also helped on a wide variety of forest land policy and planning projects, worked with non-industrial private forest landowners in the state of Michigan. And so the Conservancy has really become, I look at them as a partner, not as much as a client. In tonight's presentation, I'm going to use the word we frequently, and when I say we, I don't mean Compass Land Consultants, I mean we, the Nature Conservancy. That's really the kind of relationship that we have at this point. First, I think we need to go ahead and recognize our funding and partners in this project, the forest project here in the Lake States. You can see there's a large number of partners and funders. I'm not going to take the time, given our time constraints, to go through everybody on this list, but we certainly appreciate their kind support and both financial and personnel assets and other support that we get from our partners. I think it's important to revisit what our mission is at the Nature Conservancy. The mission of the Nature Conservancy is to conserve the lands and waters in which all life depends. And our vision is to leave a sustainable world for future generations. And that really does guide all the work that we're doing around forests here in the state of Michigan, and we're going to talk about that in a lot more detail here shortly. What I'm going to do next is the work that we're doing was just featured in the Nature Conservancy's national magazine. There were copies of that out on the table. I think there's still some out there. So if you haven't seen that article, please pick one of those magazines up. But as part of that project, they did a short video that I think really highlights the work that we're doing in forests and forestry here in Michigan. So we're just going to take a look at this, and then we'll get into the meat of the presentation. I could try to narrate, but that, yeah, I think that, as a matter of fact, that is.
I have the program up, but there's no audio.
Okay? So, I think, what's that? You know what? I think that's probably a great idea. I could try to see what I'm saying there. Yeah, this is online, so this is...
the Upper Peninsula.
Oh, gosh.
And recently, it created an easement on 10 times that much land.
I'll just rewind that now that we have that figured out.
These will be plucked.
There we are. That sounds much better.
In the heavily harvested forests of Michigan's Upper Peninsula, the Nature Conservancy is taking a unique approach to restoring trees by cutting them down. Orange slashes mark the spots where trees will be plucked from the landscape. In the woods surrounding Michigan's big two-hearted watershed, this is not preservation as usual.
The relationship between the Nature Conservancy and foresters in Michigan's Upper Peninsula is a very unique one. Most people don't think of the Nature Conservancy as cutting timber. They think of the Nature Conservancy as somebody who's protecting timber.
In fact, the Conservancy owns 23,000 acres of commercial timberland in the Upper Peninsula. And recently, it created an easement on 10 times that much land, with logging at the very core of the deal. The easement guarantees that the land will be sustainably logged in perpetuity.
Through the partnership that we have and through the work that we're doing on the Two-Hearted River Forest Reserve, we're able to conserve far more acres of forested landscape than we would through any other method. By embracing the idea of working forests and sustainable forestry, we're able to prove that you can have an ecological benefit as well as continuing to provide jobs and timber to the economy.
More than 100 years ago, a wood rush in Michigan virtually denuded these woods.
In the mid-1800s, these forests were literally cleared to help build an emerging society and culture throughout the Midwest. Those forests grew back, and those are the same forests that we're trying to conserve today. They serve to buffer the watersheds and water quality and clean the air, but they're just important as part of the fabric of who the people of the Upper Peninsula are.
In recent years, the forests almost disappeared again when investors began to eye the land for intensive logging and development. The Conservancy believed there was a better way to manage this vast acreage by using selective logging to recreate a robust forest similar to what existed before Michigan was first logged. For Jon Fosgitt and his team of timber cruisers, that means walking every inch of the forest, assessing every tree, and deciding what should stay and what should go in the name of healthy, diverse forests and clean, free-flowing rivers.
There's hundreds of undeveloped forested lakes and hundreds of miles of pristine rivers and streams left in the Upper Peninsula. As far as watersheds and river systems go, it's probably one of the healthiest, and it creates an environment where people live and work unlike most places in this part of the country. What we're trying to do in partnering with the Nature Conservancy is conserve that way of life and conserve that forested resource for future generations. Okay, well, I guess that'll be it for tonight. We can... No, it's not. That's not what I want. That still isn't what I want. And so I was pretty sure there were going to be some technical difficulties tonight. So this is the point where I usually like to stop and tell a story. There's a couple things that you need to know about me. One is I'm a tree guy. Two is, probably not in that order, I'm a story guy. And the third thing is I'm a science guy. Hey, there we go. This is where I'm supposed to be. So that's the tree guy right there. There's a couple things about this picture I want to note before I tell you a story, and we'll get back to it with another story later in the presentation. But right here in this tree, you can see this right here? That's a notch, okay? Somebody cut that with a chainsaw. All right, so just think about that for a second, and then we'll talk about it here a little bit later. I wanted to point that out. People ask me how I became a forester. And the story guy in me wants to have a great story. And I'll tell you the truth, and then I'll tell you a different story. So the truth is, I'd like to say that, I was a third-generation forester. We come from a long line of foresters, but that's not true. My dad worked for General Motors. I grew up in Midland, Michigan. My mother was a librarian. I didn't really hunt. I didn't really fish. I didn't really spend a lot of time in the woods at all growing up. But I went to Michigan Tech to play football, and I chose forestry as my curriculum. And I think it probably had something to do with the amount of calculus that I didn't have to take. But that's not a very good story. So that's a really lousy story. But I can tell you the exact moment when I knew I had it right. I was an undergraduate. I was working for a professor who had come from the University of Washington, and he still was doing a lot of research in Washington State. So he hired me to help him complete the data collection, the field portion of his work in Washington. So at the time, I traveled to UW. I was working in a lab where some of the greatest minds in forest ecology were at the time. That was sort of during and sort of post-spotted owl forest practices in the West Coast. And I was sort of immersed in this culture of science and ecology, and it had a really profound effect on me. And it was on a weekend. I was out in the Hoh Rainforest. Anybody been there, the Hoh Rainforest? Yeah, it's a magnificent place. If it's someplace that you haven't been and you're ever in Washington State, you have to go. I was sitting beneath a Sitka spruce tree. It was probably 12, 14 feet in diameter. And I was peering up through the limbs on this tree. I'm thinking, boy, those limbs are bigger than the trees we have back in Michigan. And it dawned on me that I was looking at something alive, a biological, this tree, this specimen that was probably 1,500 years old. And I looked to my left and I looked to my right, and I realized that there were 3 of those giants standing in a straight line. And the hummock, the bump that I was sitting on, was actually a nurse log, and we'll get to that in a minute. And at that point, I realized that I was probably I was having lunch on about 4,000 years of living history. And it all just it became very clear to me that everything in the forest happens for a reason. And before that, it was kind of a random collection of stuff, right? But it's not a random collection of stuff, and there's order in the forest, and there are no accidents out there. So I've spent the rest of my life from that point trying to understand those relationships so that we can either protect or better use or conserve our forested resource. So that's my story. So why do we care about forests? I mean, what's the big deal, right? Why do we care about forests as a conservation strategy? You need to think about forest as this living, breathing thing. It's a big filter, really. So a lot of the air quality that we enjoy is due to our forest. Trees, of course, take in carbon dioxide. They respire oxygen. When we talk about climate change, one of the culprits, of course, is carbon dioxide. One of the best things that we can do to sort of stave off the change we know is coming with our climates is to protect large, intact, vigorous forests. What's so great about the Great Lakes? I think we have to say it's our water. I mean, there's nowhere else that I've been that experiences and enjoys the fresh waters that we have here in Michigan, and our forests in large part are responsible for that. And of course, it's critical habitat for a wide variety of species, and biodiversity is definitely a target and something that we want to protect in our forests. And last, but certainly not least, is our forests are centers for commerce and recreation. And we talk about forests, we think about this idea of ecosystem services. I mean, there's a tremendous timber industry in the state of Michigan that pumps about $3.5 billion with a B dollars into our state economy every year. But just as important, and probably more important, is recreation and hunting and fishing and those kind of things. Today is the opening day of rifle deer season, right? You know how many tens of millions of dollars are being spent today in the forests in the state of Michigan? So we certainly want to protect those forests, and we want to protect those for future generations so that we can continue to do the things that we do here in Michigan. So before we talk about what we're doing and where we're going, I think it's really important to talk about where we've been. It's a big part of the story. There's been a tremendous amount of change in the forest in the state of Michigan over time, and so I just want to touch on that. So this will be a little bit of the science part of the presentation, and then we'll tell some stories, and then we'll, Anyway, so this is circa 1800. This was the distribution of the forest in the state of Michigan. 32.8 million acres of forest land in the state of Michigan. And you can see that it was fairly evenly divided between the deciduous forest and the mixed forest, and then the sort of the woody wetland and evergreen forest were equal components as well. But almost the entire state was forested. There were people here in 1800, and there were people using the forest, but not at any degree where it became a big agent of change in the forested landscape. The forest we're going to talk about tonight is the deciduous forest and that mixed forest. So about half of the landscape in 1800 was in this dark green that you see, and then this sort of yellow color that you can see. That's the forest that we're talking about. That's the forest that we're working on protecting today. I mean, we're working on protecting all forests, but that's really our big target with the work that we're doing on the two-hearted. Fast forward to 1992. That map looks a lot different. We've lost 12 million acres of forest. So just lost a third of the forest, 37% of the forest cover. But then you can see that distribution. The colors have changed. So you have this large deciduous forest. We've virtually lost that evergreen forest. That mixed forest is almost entirely gone off the landscape. So there's been a tremendous amount of change, and we're going to talk about why that change happened. Here's another illustration of that change. I really like this. So where did our forest go? The bright yellow is changed to agriculture. At some point we figured out that trees really don't taste that good, and we decided that we should probably dedicate some resources to growing something else. And then you can see the change to urban in this gray area. So, but when you look at the northern part of the state of Michigan, right, we think about the Northwoods. I mean, we all think about the Northwoods. You drive up I-75, you drive up 27, you get to Clary, you get to West Branch, you're up north, right? I mean, that's something that we want to protect. But let's look at the change here. So no change in forest cover is bright green. So there's quite a bit of that bright green here throughout the northern peninsula. But you've got this dark green, which dominates this map, and that means that there was a change in forest cover types. And we're going to talk about that here in a second and why that happened. All right, science warning. We're going to get into a little bit of science here. Okay, I promise I won't do this too much. So I think we talked about where that forest was spatially. Now I think we need to talk about what that forest looked like and how it served ecologically. I guess I'll start with this diagram over here. And I'll start here. It's kind of a chicken and egg thing. Do you start at the beginning or do you start at the end? I don't know. I'm going to start at the end. So circa 1800, we had a largely unmanaged, what we could consider an old growth, I call it late successional forest. And what did that forest look like? You had great big trees, you had medium-sized trees, you had little trees, you had all of this structural diversity. With that structural diversity came a tremendous amount of species diversity. Those historical forests contained 10, 12, sometimes 14 species all in the same forested stand. That's largely been lost today, and we'll talk about that here in a minute. But you need to think about what drives change in a forest ecosystem. So, you know, is this a steady state? Well, it is and it isn't. In this mixed forest, in this northern hardwood hemlock forest, change came secondary to wind events primarily. Fire wasn't a big part of this ecosystem. We call this the asbestos forest, as a matter of fact. Historically, it would have burned about every 2,000 years. You did have some pest and pathogen problems, but those problems didn't really crop up until we got here. So wind was the biggest driver of change. And you think about how does wind affect a forest? Well, it doesn't knock down 300 acres. What it would do is it would take one of these great big old trees, and it might start to get a little rotten, or it might have some limbs broke off it. And then the wind is going to knock this tree over. And when it comes over, it's going to knock these trees over, and it's going to create what we call a canopy gap. It's going to create a hole in the forest. Sometimes it was 1/5 of an acre. Sometimes it was as big as 2 or 3 acres, but relatively small when you look at that 32 million acres of forest land. And that set what we call a successional pathway into motion. So now you've got a hole, there's no more trees, and all the sun comes into the forest floor. And so you get stand initiation. You get all these little trees that have been sitting there in the understory for 50 years just waiting for a ray of sun, and now it has it. And all of a sudden they take off, right? So we call this the the teenage, it's the young forest. I call it the early successional forest. But for tonight, I'm going to ask you to remember some of this. That's sort of our teenagers. That's our teenage forest. Well, then those trees grow, and they're very uniform. They're even age. They're all the same age. They're the same size. They're the same height. They're very uniform canopy. And those things start to grow. So for the next 40 or 50 years, those trees get taller. They get bigger. They continue that till they're 70 or 80. So this is sort of the middle-aged forest, mid-successional. You start to get a few different species coming in the shade underneath. And then finally, 150, 200 years out, you would start to get back to this old multi-age where the wind was taking stuff down. So that's sort of a forest succession 101. If I wanted to bore you guys, I could go through all this stuff, but I won't do that. But the three things are, we've got early successional, secondary to disturbance, mid-successional, that middle-aged forest, and then this old multi-age forest. So remember those three things, and I think we'll be okay. All right, time out for some forestry definitions. I realized when I gave this presentation a few days ago that I was talking forestry talk, and maybe not everybody in the room gets all that stuff. So I'm just going to talk about a few definitions that you've heard me use, or you'll hear me use. Snag. What is a snag? A snag is a dead tree. That historical forest had a lot of dead trees because the trees got old enough to die, simply put. And snags are very important for a lot of wildlife species. Obviously woodpeckers, there's a lot of different species that use snags. You heard me talk about a nurse log. That Sitka spruce grew on a nurse log. So what happens is a tree would fall to the forest floor, and over time it would start to rot, and then it would become a perfect organic seedbed for then tree species to land on and then start to grow. There are certain species, hemlock, yellow birch, some of those things, that absolutely require nurse logs for stand initiation, or they prefer them. They don't require them, but they prefer them. We also refer to nurse logs as coarse woody debris. If that doesn't sound scientific, I don't know what does. So coarse woody debris, nurse logs. FSC, I mentioned FSC, that's the Forest Stewardship Council. Third-party certifying body. So there's a third-party independent auditor that comes in and certifies your forestry practices as being sustainable. All the land that we manage, and on the Two-Hearted, and all the land that we manage with the Nature Conservancy nationwide is certified sustainable by the Forest Stewardship Council. You'll see that logo in Home Depot and Staples and a lot of different places. So if you pick up a product and it has that FSC logo on it, you know that the wood that's sourced to that product was actually harvested and managed in a sustainable way. Regeneration. So I'll talk about regen a lot. Stand initiation, young trees growing up. CFA is the Michigan's Commercial Forest Act. We're going to talk about that in a little bit. But what Michigan's Commercial Forest Act does is for industrial or institutional landowners, if you have a management plan on file that's been approved by the state of Michigan, then you're enrolled in the Commercial Forest Act. You get significant tax breaks because you're providing jobs and timber to the economy, but you also leave your land open for public recreation, hiking, fishing, hunting, those kind of things. That's very important. Silviculture is really the art and practice of forestry. Silviculture is understanding all of these interactions that I talked about and how we use that understanding of the forest ecology to manage a forest stand towards a desired future condition. And this one is an important one. Preserve versus reserve. A lot of people kind of step back when they think about the Nature Conservancy cutting trees down. That seems counterintuitive. There's two things that the Nature Conservancy do, and in my opinion, they do very well. And one is the preserve. So the Nature Conservancy has a network of preserves across the state of Michigan. And those are places that the Nature Conservancy has purchased with partners to protect a certain ecological component on the landscape. Maybe it's a rare and threatened species, maybe it's a rare ecosystem, maybe it's just a special place in the state of Michigan that we want to protect, we want to save, it's hands-off in perpetuity. A reserve is a term that we use with the Nature Conservancy. It's conservation. Conservation, reserve, same thing. It's a much different thing. And what we're doing with our working lands approach to conservation is that we want to protect a forested resource. We know that we can't take 10 million acres of forest land and lock it up and turn it into a preserve. We want to have a landscape level change in the way in which these forests are managed, and we're doing that through conservation practices. So we're managing the landscape, but yet we're protecting the ecological and hopefully improving the ecological integrity of those forests. So big difference. So what happened? The big cut, right? 1850s, mid-1800s, towards the end of the 1800s. We cleared the state of Michigan from one end to the other. Literally cleared this entire state. And when I stop and think about that, there's two things that I think about. One is, with all the modern equipment and harvesting equipment and logging that takes place in the state of Michigan today, we are growing twice as much timber as we harvest every year. That's an important thing for everybody here to realize, is that our net growth exceeds our net harvest by 100%. We're growing more wood than we're harvesting. So that's very important in a protection of forests if you want to think about it at the state level. So why did this happen? So you had emerging society in the lower lakes. We had this great network, this infrastructure of waterways, rivers, and the Great Lakes in order to transport this timber down the lakes to the mills where they built Chicago and Detroit and all this emerging society in the lower lakes. But, I mean, a lot of that wood went for construction, but you need to think about wood too. That's how everybody heated their home. They weren't plugged into Mishcon, and they didn't have natural gas. They heated their homes with wood. It was their gasoline, right? Steam engines. All of the trains that hauled this wood and the men up to the mines and all the people in the lower parts of the state, all of those steam trains ran on wood. They didn't run on coal. Same thing with a lot of the agricultural implements. So wood was really everything in that society, and as a result, they harvested a lot of it. So what happened though? So what happened with the big cut is it started that successional pathway. But instead of 3 acres of initiation of the teenagers coming up, of those young trees coming up, it was 32 million acres of those young trees coming up. So it was successional on a grand, it was that successional pathway on a grand scale. And when we talk about successional, so all the sun comes in, so you had short-lived species like aspen, like birch, like balsam fir that came in because they really liked the sun. And they started to grow through their teenage years, and they thought they were invincible and they were tough and they were growing fast and didn't really listen to anybody. And then they started to get taller, and all of a sudden they started to cast some shade on the ground. And in the shade grew the tree species that we see today. So the sugar maples and the yellow birch and the oak and the hemlock and the white pine, and some of these things kind of started to come up underneath. Well, those early successional species like aspen and birch, they die when they get to be 60, 70 years old. But then here's this forest that had come up underneath it to replace it. So it started that successional clock at the state level. So what happened? That led to our modern forests. Let's just pick a date, 1860. Let's just say that was when the last tree was cut in the state of Michigan. Of course it wasn't, but that started that successional clock. And so you can imagine from 1860 till World War II, what happened? 80 or 90 years went by. And so those forests were replaced. And they came back to sugar maple and yellow birch, and there was all of these species that came back in this middle-aged forest, right? So now you've got this relatively uniform canopy, all of these healthy, vigorous trees, good quality that came back as a result of the big cut. And what happened? World War II happened. And then, of course, we had another building boom in the United States. And so we went back to our forests that were now 90 or 100 years old, and we started to harvest forest products again. During that time, the idea of modern forestry kind of grew out of that time. In the 1940s, 50s, there was a lot of research that was going on at universities on how can we manage these forests to what? Maximize production and maximize growth of the residual stands. And the hardwood silvicultural methods that we still employ today grew out of the 50s. And very simply put, what those mean, well, what those are, is that you can go into a hardwood stand like this, and you can take about 25% of the volume out in a harvest, and in 10 years it'll grow back, and you'll have the same, essentially the same stand again, and you'll do another thinning. And 10 years later you'll do another thinning, and science has proven that that maximized growth and yield on those forested stands. So that started in about 1950, and a large part of our hardwood forest has been managed that way ever since. Well, what it's done is it's basically, we have this chronic middle-aged forest. It stopped the successional clock at that middle-aged state. So as we go in and we manage these stands, we have healthy, vigorous trees, which is not a bad thing, but we've lost a lot of ecological function. So you've got this uniform canopy, right? We don't get trees growing big and falling down dead because they get cut. And so we've got this uniform, sort of homogeneous forest that has been a result to a certain degree. So that's one thing that we've identified in the modern forest as being a conservation target. I need to talk to you a little bit about forest land ownership real quick because this is the next part of the story. So there was a big land grab after the big cut and all the land sort of settled out. And in Michigan, think of a pie chart. Half of that pie chart is public ownership. Michigan DNR, Federal Forest Service, those type of agencies, National Park Service. The other half of that pie chart, roughly, is private timberland. And that's divided further in half into non-industrial private forest landowners, folks like you sitting in this room, and then industrial private forest landowners. And a large percentage of the harvesting that's taken place in the state of Michigan has been on those industrial private timberlands. And for the last 60 years, those were owned by companies that had a mill. So if you had a mill that made 2x4s, or you had a mill that made veneer or fence posts or paper, you owned the land that a large percentage of your wood grew on that then went into your mill that you then sold your final product. We called those vertically integrated forest products companies. And for a lot of years in this country, vertically integrated forest products companies they owned all the private timberland. I went to work for a vertically integrated forest products company. That wasn't that long ago. That's changed. Of the 54 million acres of private industrial timberland in the United States, only 200,000 is still owned by a vertically integrated forest product company. So you say, well, who owns that 54 million acres? And it's TIMOs. TIMO is a Timberland Investment Management Organization. And a TIMO owns forest land for a completely different reason than a vertically integrated forest products company. And what the model is that they're going to buy land. They're going to own it for a set period of time, and it depends on the investor, but it's 10 to 15 years. And while they own it, they're going to manage the timber, and they're going to make a little bit of money. But then they're going to sell it. And what they want to do is make their money on the sale of the land, the appreciation in land value, and that's how they satisfy their investor objectives. And in the lake states, that's returned about 7 to 9% annually for the last 20 years. So it's been pretty good. So with this TIMO transition, it's completely turned the world of forestry upside down. Companies like mine didn't exist 20 years ago. I manage land for TIMOs now. They don't have a mill. They don't have a bunch of people, foresters that work for the mill that put wood into the mill. They hire companies like me a lot of the time to manage those lands. So there's been this big turnover in the land ownership in the state of Michigan. So you say, well, why does that matter, and where does a nature conservancy fit in? And the answer is the big UP deal. We affectionately call it the big UP deal. And you know, it was 2001. I know that for a fact because Helen Taylor, who's going to speak to you later in this series, tells a story of they were in an airplane looking at a piece of property on September 11th, this piece of property I'm going to talk to you about. So it was 2001. 500,000 acres of timberland went for sale in the UP. And so there were a lot of bidders, a lot of TIMOs, and a lot of people came to the UP and they started to look at this land base as an investment. And the Nature Conservancy at that time was interested in that landscape and that land base because what it effectively did, I call it a hole in the donut. You had all this federal National Park Service and Pictured Rocks National Lakeshore. You had all this federal timberland and sort of the eastern UP, and then you had this matrix of DNR land throughout the central UP, and within that matrix was this 500,000 acres. So this 500,000 acres that was for sale basically filled that hole in the donut, and it would have protected that entire landscape, essentially the central portion of the UP, that big swath with this 500,000 acres would have been protected. The Conservancy was not a successful bidder. A TIMO from North Carolina was a successful bidder, and they took ownership of that land, I think, in 2002. So at that time, the big UP deal was born out of that desire to continue to protect that landscape. And so what the big UP deal was is a conservation easement. And that's a different thing to think about. But an easement is a deed restriction on the land that says you're going to manage the land sustainably. It's going to reduce the number of potential outsales that you have, thereby eliminating fragmentation or reducing fragmentation. It protected, well, 423 square miles of forest, lakes, and rivers. It was 255,000 acres, 660 lakes and streams, 80% of the Two-Hearted River watershed, 52,000 acres of wetlands, and 60 miles of buffer to some of the most important prestigious natural areas in the state. So what it was a conservation easement, a deed restriction that was purchased from the landowner that put this protection in place. So what it did was it effectively protected that very landscape that they were concerned about when the land came up for sale. It was a different way of thinking about doing it, but the deal got done. As part of that, the Two-Hearted River watershed became a very important target. And the landowner at the time, the TMO, said, you know what, guys, it'd probably be easier if you just own that land. So they said, sure. So 24,000 acres of land, all of this land in orange, was transferred to the Nature Conservancy, fee ownership. Now the Nature Conservancy owns this 24,000 acres, and we manage that now as part of the Two-Hearted River Forest Reserve. It's enrolled in Michigan's Commercial Forest Act, so we manage it sustainably. It's open for public recreation, and so we are now a landowner, a big landowner in this watershed. The purple lands, these are those easement lands I told you about. These are owned by the TMO but have the conservation easement, okay? This bright green, this is a core preserve. This is a place that, this is a pattern peatland. This is a place that we've locked up, set aside, and we're gonna let nature take its course. You can see Michigan Nature Association has a little piece of this pie, Michigan Audubon Society, Michigan Nature Association again, and then all of this sort of tan khaki color, this is the state of Michigan, Michigan DNR. So when we talk about landscape level protection, this landscape has been protected. This is going to be managed sustainably where the health of the forest is going to remain open for public access in perpetuity. So 100 years from now, in my head, you're going to be able to go out on the Two-Hearted River watershed and it probably won't look a whole lot different than it does today. And I think that's a real success story. So now what? I mean, now the Nature Conservancy owns a bunch of commercial forest land. So what do we do? So that's when my company and the Nature Conservancy got together, and we originally started by writing a management plan and satisfying the requirements of the Commercial Forest Act, getting the land FSC certified, and we set about the business of managing a large landscape. And I think it was a learning curve for everybody involved. Originally, what our goal was to restore and enhance the ecological integrity of the forest. So I talked about that chronic middle-aged forest. That forest doesn't have the species diversity that it once had, it doesn't have the structural diversity that it once had, and we know that it's lost some ecological function. So we wanted to use management as a tool to restore those attributes in that forest. We wanted to promote and protect local jobs and timber economy through sustainable forest management. So our hypothesis was, not only can we fix the ecology and protect the way the forest functions, we can continue to provide jobs and sustain the people of this small community that rely on these forests and these forest products. Of course, we wanted to protect the Two-Hearted River and the fresh waters of the watershed, and we've done some amazing things there, and we'll get to that in a second. And then we wanted to establish partnership and demonstrate practices, because at the end of the day, if we're doing this on 24,000 acres, that's great, but we'd love to do it on 24 million. So we want to establish partnerships, and we want to demonstrate the things that we're doing. So how do we do it? That's Gino. He's a logger. That's some poor, unfortunate, bald individual who has to cover his head in the winter. That's me. And this was on our first timber sale. And so we had this bold idea that we're just going to go out there and restore these forests. So this first timber sale was a stand that was 98% sugar maple, right? What's one of the first things we're taught when we're little kids? Don't put all your eggs in one basket. Well, all of our eggs were in one basket in this stand. And stands that could produce quality sugar maple were pushed towards production of sugar maple because it just happens to be the most valuable timber species in the state of Michigan. So we had a stand, chronic middle-aged stand. that was 97, 98% sugar maple. So we went about and we said, well, we want to promote species diversity. We want to grow local native trees. We want to promote structural diversity. We want to do some of these things. So what our thought was is that we're going to look for yellow birch. Yellow birch were once as much as 30% of these forested stands, 30%. And it's now 98% sugar maple. So we're going to look for yellow birch, and we're going to create these seed trees. They like a little bit of sun to hit the forest floor. So we're going to create these gaps around these trees to see if we can get native yellow birch to grow back. And slowly over time, we're going to encourage yellow birch to be part of this forested stand. Sounds easy. We went through 97 acres, probably, do the math, 20,000 trees. We found 4 yellow birch. 1, 2, 3, 4. And we created our seed tree gaps, and we thought, well, it's going to take a little time. This might not be quite as easy as we thought it was going to be. Story time. I showed you that notch on that tree in the beginning slide, right? So this guy right here, Gino, and I were driving down the road one day in my pickup truck, and he's telling story. He's a story guy too, let me tell you, big story guy. And we're driving down the road, and if anybody knows me, I'm a tree guy, and if I see a nice tree through the woods, I'm liable to slam on the brakes, back up, and make you look at it. So I'm driving down the road, I slam on the brakes, I say, oh my gosh, look at that yellow birch, that's a big yellow birch. Boy, there aren't many of those left. Gino says, that's bad. I'm like, what do you mean it's bad? He says, oh, it's hollow. I said, how can you tell that tree's hollow? We're 150 feet away, you tell me that tree's hollow. He says, yeah, that tree's hollow. I said, how do you know that? He says, 1984, I cut a notch in that tree, and it was hollow. I said, you know what? So I got out of the truck, I walked out through the woods, I walked around the backside of that tree, and here's this notch, rotten old notch. And he's standing there doing this thing with the suspenders, right? But the story is, first of all, he's a 3rd generation logger. His kids are 4th generation loggers, they work with him. And these are the guys that are doing our restoration work, right? They're loggers, this is what they do. These are the people we want to protect, and we want them to be able to come to the forest and do what they do and support their families and the local economy. That's one part of the story. Second part of the story is, imagine that. They literally went through this landscape and they cut every single yellow birch. And the reason was, think about 1970, right? There was a veneer bill built in Munising, Michigan. And at that time, all that flat front kitchen cabinetry that was kind of wood colored, right? That was all yellow birch veneer. That's where it came from. So we said, well, we want to restore the yellow birch. That's going to be tough. We realized that we had a lot to learn. So the story of this slide is, there's way too much stuff to talk about here, is that we developed a new measuring stick that really talks about what are the true ecological attributes of the forest. And this is actually data from that stand we just talked about. Some of the things to note is trees larger than 19-inch DBH, there's only 4.5 per acre. It should be over 13. Large snags, those little big dead trees, 1/2 of one dead tree per acre. I'm not sure what that half a tree looks like, but it should be over 9. That's where we want to get. Large coarse woody debris, 31 cubic feet. There should be over 1,000. So we know we developed these new measures that tells us what the true ecological function is. So what do? We develop a plan. There's a seed tree. There's a yellow birch right there in the lower right-hand corner. These are the guys here that do it for us. These are foresters. These are guys that work for me, and they're out there every day marking timber and cruising timber, and these guys know the forest better than anybody. So what do? So after that harvest, we said, well, we know that we want to encourage species diversity. We know we want to encourage structural diversity. We want coarse wood. We want all this stuff. So we went ahead and let science be our guide. And that's what I love about the Nature Conservancy, is that we're going to do the science, we're going to invest the time and money to figure out if our practices are advancing our goals of increasing that ecological integrity. So this was a big harvest that we did. It was like 300 acres. And we put all these different gaps on the landscape, and we changed the size, 60-foot gaps, 90-foot gaps, 120-foot gaps, replicating those trees falling down in the forest. We knew that 10% of the forest was probably in a gap at one point in time, so we put 10% of the forest back into a gap. Maybe we'll get some of those species back. We certainly know we'll get the structural diversity that we want. So we went ahead and we went about doing this big scientific project. There's what it looks like today. This is a 2012 air photo, right? You can see those gaps that we put on the landscape, and you can see they're filling in. And we're actually starting to get white pine and yellow birch and some of those species back in those gaps. So we're doing the hard work, we're doing the science. We want science to be our guide so that our management practices are going to make all of those numbers on that complicated sheet improve over time. How do we do it? I told you the story about Gino. We're using local guys, local loggers to get the job done. Look at that, money does grow on trees. $3.5 billion annually put into the economy in the state of Michigan. I don't think we'd have to look too far from where we are in Detroit to see how important that kind of money in this economy is. Another thing that we need to do is prove that this is financially prudent, right? We're doing this on 24,000 acres. But if we want other people to do this, we're going to have to prove that this makes good fiscal sense, that this is a good investment in our forests. And so we're doing discounted cash flow analysis of our management practices. We're doing growth and yield analysis. And the take-home story is that, you know what, we can stand up from an investment standpoint and prove that our practices make a lot of sense fiscally. How do we do it? This is what we want to protect. This is the ultimate goal. This is the south branch of the Two-Hearted River. This is one of the best stretches of brook trout water in the state of Michigan. I could tell you where that picture was taken, but I'd probably have to kill you because there's a lot of trout there. We went ahead and we took the Two-Hearted watershed and we prioritized. So the biggest threat to the watershed is road stream crossings, right? Where a road crosses a stream. They were built for logging. They were built for county infrastructure. We went through the entire watershed and we prioritized all the road stream crossings for removal, repair, or replacement. The red ones are high priority, yellow, as you can imagine, are moderate, and green are pretty good. So we went about the business to establish partnerships, work with the county road commissions, work with the other landowners, and obtain a great deal of funding through our partners and through the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, through the federal government, and the Nature Conservancy put all that together. So what do? South branch of the Two-Hearted River. 2 42-inch culverts and a 36-inch steel culvert. The river's 40 feet wide there, okay? That's a bad crossing. 9.6 tons of sediment annually go into the river at that crossing. That'd be like taking a dump truck, parking it on those culverts and just dumping it into the river and going home and say, well, there's our sedimentation for the year. We want to fix that. So what do? We developed a plan. What I want to show you here is there's those culverts, 48-inch, 48-inch, 42-inch. I lied, it's 42, it's not 36. This is our proposed structure, a bridge, right? Look at the difference in waterway opening. Imagine if you're a brook trout and you're trying to swim through these culverts. All that water is getting forced through those culverts. It's moving so fast you can't swim through the culverts. It's a stopper. Aquatic organisms can't move through those culverts. So we wanted to replace them. So we got the money and we did. You can see there's the end of those culverts right there, right? There's the old road. Here's the new road. Here's what it looks like today. So that's the kind of work that we're doing on the Two-Hearted, and those are the things that we want to fix, because what's so great about the Great Lakes? Our fresh water. This opened up 19 miles of stream habitat that wasn't open before when those culverts were there. Partnerships and outreach, like I said, we want to spread the word. We're working with the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science. As it turns out, this type of management that we're doing is really smart when it comes to climate change, right? Diversity is probably one of the best things that we can do to guard against a changing forest secondary to climate change. I gave the analogy of, imagine going to your retirement planner and saying, you know what, I want to take all my money, all of it, and I want to invest in Facebook. He's going to drop out of his chair, he's going to hit the floor. No, you need to diversify your portfolio. Well, we need to diversify our forests. Same thing. We're working toward Forest Guild model forest status. This would elevate the Two-Hearted River Forest Reserve as a model forest in the nationwide recognition. We're working with other organizations and universities to demonstrate best practices, do research. I just gave a tour to a group of college kids last week. Oh, I got a little carried away. And of course, we're participating in community outreach and facilitating larger discussions around forest conservation, which is part of the reason why I'm here today. Sounds pretty easy, right? There's not a lot of things going on up there. We got it all figured out. What are the threats to our work? Patrick Doran was here last week. How many people were here last week? Oh, quite a few. That's great. It's a big threat, and we know forests are changing, and Michigan's forests are in a unique place. We're at the northern extent of the northern hardwood forest, we're at the southern extent of the boreal forest, we're at the western extent of a lot of forests. So we're at this place where we know species are going to shift and things are going to change. So we're developing a strategy to try to combat that change that we know is coming. And some of the diversity issues and protecting the ecological function that we've talked about tonight are the best thing that we can do that, how we can do that. Invasive species, this is a big problem. We've got invasive plants, we've got invasive insects, we've got invasive diseases. This is emerald ash borer. This is a gallery that's caused from the emerald ash borer. Somebody talked about Dutch elm disease. We've got beech bark disease in the UP that's going to kill 90% of our American beech trees in the UP. Again, what's the best way to protect against this? Diversity. I mean, that's just, it only makes sense to me from a diversity standpoint. That's the best thing we can do. If you've got a stand that's 97% sugar maple and the next thing that comes along the line is the four-horned maple bug, what's going to happen? You know, it's not a very smart strategy. There's plants that are here, and there's a lot of plants, and we could give a whole presentation on that, but they snuff out native vegetation. And then, of course, these diseases. So we're working on trying to understand that interaction and what we can do to help prevent that. Fragmentation and parcelization. It's a big deal protected against fragmentation. This is the Two-Hearted River watershed. 100 years from now, guess what? It's going to look just like that. As these lands are sold and bought and sold and bought, the size keeps getting smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller, and that's a threat to the work that we do. So we need to try to talk to private landowners about forest management. You know, the conservation easement helped protect these large landscapes, so we need to think about what fragmentation and parcelization is going to do to the work that we do. And as it turns out, coincidentally, there's some people here that are going to talk to you about a lot of those same issues. On January 24th, Scott Soa is going to talk to you about Centers for Commerce, Culture, and Conservation. He's going to talk about the Great Lakes waterways. He's going to talk to you about invasives. He's going to touch on climate change. February 21st, thanks for stopping by. Dave Ewart is going to give a fantastic presentation on, I'm sure, migratory birds and fragmentation and parcelization and how that's impacting critical habitat for a lot of migratory birds. Lindsay Chatterton is going to talk to you a lot about invasive species, particularly in the Great Lakes. And then our state director, Helen Taylor, is going to kind of bring it all together for us and talk about this changing scale of conservation. I touched on the big UP deal. She's going to go into a lot more detail about that, no doubt. And then how we can kind of tie all of these things together. So with that, I'd like to thank a couple people at the Nature Conservancy that helped me put this presentation together, Emily and Martha and Jamie in the back of the room, Lisa Nemi. I'd certainly like to thank Cranbrook Institute for having me tonight. And last but not least, I would like to thank all of you for attending. So with that, we'll have a few minutes to take some questions. And I'm going to throw up if you want to learn more about the work that we're doing, here's a couple places, nature.org, nature.org Michigan. See the places that we work. And it's all there on the internet. So thank you. Questions?
Yeah, the holes you cut, I just take it you did no planting in any of those holes.
Not yet. So, right. So what we did was historically, those forests would have had 10% in that gap. We did it all in 1 year. Obviously, that wouldn't have happened naturally, but because of economy of scale and those kind of things, that's what we did. So what we're doing is we're monitoring those gaps to see if we can get our desired outcome. Can I get some yellow birch? Can I get some white pine? I'm actually seeing a little bit of black cherry coming back in those gaps. We want to encourage, we call it natural dynamic silviculture. We want native species, we want natural process to take place. The next cut for me and my scientific mind, the science guy, what I'd like to do is take a smaller portion of those plots and I'd like to scarify them, expose the mineral soil in those and see if that'll help maybe establish some yellow birch. And then I'd like to take a smaller portion and grow some local genotype yellow birch in a greenhouse and go ahead and plant yellow birch in a portion of those gaps. So in my perfect world, 25% of those gaps would be planted, 25% would have some sort of scarification, 25% would let nature take its course, and we could kind of compare then moving forward what is going to have the best effect. You know, we're trying to basically speed up the successional clock. I mean, if we wanted to wait 200 years, the thing would just turn back, but we can't do that. So we want to try to make that happen as quick as we can. So in my mind, that's the next thing I want to do there.
So you said genetic, so other local forest yellow birch seedlings, then you would finally get to 4 feet or whatever it was, and then.
Right. Actually, there's a couple yellow birch on that sale. That was a 238 acre sale, 3 yellow birch. What I want to do is I want to set up, again, this is my harebrained idea, I want to set up this tent underneath, and I want to collect seed from a tree on that site and then grow those in the greenhouse. So
I spend a lot of time up along the Asabo.
Yeah.
On the south branch of the Asabo. I see these massive areas of clear cut. They've just cut every single thing down.
right.
What's that all about? That doesn't strike me as being consistent. Maybe I'm wrong, but that doesn't sound like the kind of thing that you're doing. What's the DNR doing there and why they're doing it?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. I'm glad you asked that question, because in that part of the world, you see a lot of those clear cuts. And I talked to you today about the hardwood hemlock forest. White pine would have been a big part of that overstory historically. Fire and large disturbance was not a part of that ecosystem ever, historically, every 2,000 years. The forests that you're talking about are probably jack pine dominated with red pine mixed in. And if we looked at that map, those have always been that way. That is a fire system. Fire is king in that system. And historically, those stands would have burned every 70 years, complete burn. So those species are much different. They're those teenagers. That's the early successional forest. So what the DNR is actually doing there is that is a silvicultural method that mimics what would have happened naturally. In order to regenerate jack pine, you need to clear cut, and then a lot of time they'll burn the slash. Ever seen where they come in and burn afterwards? Jack pine only open their cone unless they're burned. They'll hold on to those seeds forever unless those cones are burned, and then they release their seed. There's something else going on there in Kirtland warbler. So Kirtland warbler is a threatened and endangered species. And as it turns out, Kirtland warbler like really short, really dense jack pine. So there's some really intensive management going on in that part of the state in order to protect that breeding habitat of the Kirtland warbler. So it may be 1 or 2 of those things that you're seeing, but that's pretty shocking stuff when that happens. But there are ecosystems in the state of Michigan where historically fire was the big driver. And those jack pine, red pine forested ecosystems are the ones that that type of management's taking place. We don't really own any of that forest up here in the UP, so we haven't really worked on a lot of restoration strategies in that forest type. We've just recently acquired 600 acres near Cummins, Michigan, so kind of in the same neighborhood. And we're going to be looking at that ecosystem and conservation goals and the ecology and see if there's something we can do there.
The same way, if you had those lands, would you clear cut from as far as the eye can see, or would you selectively cut?
Yeah, so as far as the eye can see would not have been natural. They would have been smaller patches. That fire would have worked itself across the landscape. There was a 20,000 acre fire in the UP this year at the Duck Lake Fire. And I was able to look at the Duck Lake fire from the air, and you would think that 20,000 acres just burned completely and turned black. You'd be amazed at how many islands of green trees are still left within that fire area. And that would be a more natural pattern of how that disturbance were to take place. So I guess to answer that question, I think I would want to try to mimic the natural process so we can start that successional clock as best we can. So, but clear cuts are part of that system. Yep, we got all kinds of hands. Who's next?
What do the TMOs do after they hold the land for so long and waiting for it to appreciate it? Presume they're going to
Yeah,
sell it.
right.
And what are they selling it for?
To another TMO. So what happens is, the way it works is, let's just use a number of $500 an acre, and that was a realistic land value 10 years ago. So they buy the land at $500 an acre. They're going to manage the timber while they own it. And they're going to make a little bit of money, but they're really not going to make that much money. And then what they're hoping for is that land will sell for $800 to $1,000 an acre in 10 or 15 years. And that's where they make their return. So the big deal, right? So these guys bought this land at $500 an acre, let's say. Well, we went in and said, well, we'll give you $200 an acre if you put this conservation easement on it. We just satisfied part of the return objective. Now it's a lot easier for them to hold it, and then they're going to experience the kind of returns that they want to at the end. So it was kind of a win for the TMO, it was a win for conservation, understanding the reason they own that land.
But ultimately, it could be sold for any commercial use, whether it be a resort or cutting
That's right, without any type of easement. So one of the things that they can do, so there's another organization that I didn't talk about, it's called a Reit, R-E-I-T, Real Estate Investment Trust. And they tend to look at what we call HBU, highest best use parcels. So lakes, rivers, the kind of things that people want to buy and build a cabin or whatever. And that's where the parcelization and fragmentation becomes an issue, is that in order to satisfy their investment objective, they might sell off some of that highest best use development land. So that's a definite possibility.
And that's how it gets smaller in time, as you mentioned.
Exactly. Those land transactions 20 years ago were 600,000 acres, 500,000 acres. We've done deals as big as 800,000 acres. We're now doing deals at 30,000 acres. It's still a lot of land, but it's shrinking. And that's how they're going to get the most value out of it.
So does that easement that you have, does that go on forever, or does it go on with that current owner?
Forever.
Forever.
Forever. Yep, that is a deed that's attached right to the deed on that 255,000 acres. And the next landowner has to abide by the terms of that easement, and the next landowner, the next landowner. So that's...
You can't build on it or anything?
No, there's a limited number of parcels that they could sell as part of that deal, but that land will largely, and there's a tremendous number of lakes and rivers that will never be developed. It's protected forever as part of the deal. It's a great deal. Yeah.
The gentleman had a question about clearing along the Osabo.
Oh, yeah, I'm like, wow, where's that coming from? Hi.
And I imagine that many of us have questions, similar questions about different areas around the state.
Right.
How do we find out why was my particular area clear cut, and what is the plan for here? Is there a place to research that, or?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, with particularly the Michigan DNR and the U.S. Forest Service, they have public comment periods for development of their management plans. So you can go into your local DNR office and say that you're concerned about management on the Osabo, or maybe you're up, you're in the UP, but you can go into your division, your district office, and they will not only share their management plan with you, but they'll let you know when there's an opportunity for you to provide feedback on the development of that plan. The U.S. Forest Service even has a more elaborate process. As a landowner in the UP, I get letters from the U.S. Forest Service when they're proposing management activities on some of the neighboring lands. So they do communicate those type of things to people in the public. Yep.
Do you have much of an invasive species problem up there?
Not yet, right? I mean, we've got some of these beech bark disease. That's invasive. It's a little scale insect and a fungus that came from Europe 100 years ago. Hammerlash borer, of course. But as far as the plant species are concerned, we have some, but it certainly isn't some of the things that we see down here with Phragmites and buckthorn and some of the really nasty invasives. We're fortunate in the UP that we've got this 5 miles of water called the Straits of Mackinac, and a lot of that stuff has to find itself over the bridge, which it will do on car tires and some of those kind of things, but it's really slowed the spread north. Yep.
Is fracking going on up there?
Fracking?
Yeah.
No, not in the UP. There's really no gas or oil development in the UP at all. That's very northern, northeastern, lower. Yeah. I'm going to get a couple out of the back of the room here.
I had the...
Oh, there's the mic.
There we go. The question I had was, how does your plan to build up that woody humus?
Coarse woody debris?
Coarse woody debris in light of the dryness and this Duck Lake fire. How can you get that wood to lay there and get that back?
Yeah.
Seems like that's kind of a catch-22 situation.
Yeah, so in that forest, coarse woody debris was a pretty big part of it. It was hardwood trees that were our coarse wood. And hardwood trees rot relatively quickly. I mean, imagine taking a piece of maple and sticking it in the dirt in your backyard. In 2 years, it's going to be. So originally, we thought we were going to actually have to have loggers cut trees down and then leave them lay. And just say, no, that tree gets to stay. And I'm pretty sure they would have thought we were absolutely crazy then. But secondary to beech bark disease, guess what? We've got our crop of coarse woody debris. Unfortunately, we've experienced on the two-hearted, probably we talk about 90% mortality in the UP. I'm going to say we're at about 99% mortality on the two-hearted in our American beech. And so what's happening is they're standing dead now as snags, and they get what's called beech snap, where the wind breaks them off So we are not going to have to worry about where our next generation of coarse wood's going to come from, unfortunately, because of the beach. So we're letting that take place.
Is the fire, though, was like the Duck Lake,
Yeah.
is that part of that dry wood? that's
No, it
laying
wasn't.
around?
So the Duck Lake fire, very much like the Asable that this gentleman over here talked about, was jack pine, red pine dominated ecosystem, which fire was part of that system, and we pulled it out of that system secondary to our management for a lot of years. That's why that fire was so bad. We lost about 1,000 acres on the Two-Hearted to that fire, but a core of our property is in that hardwood hemlock forest type. Yep.
Who do you say you're pleased to? You're locking up the log trees.
Local loggers. We sell only locally, so we work with loggers from generally Newberry, and then those logs get marketed throughout the UP. A lot of that wood gets marketed for home heating fuel. A lot of people heat their wood, or their homes with wood.
Money then go back to the Conservancy? Or
The money goes right back to the Conservancy, and we fix road stream crossings, and we do all other kinds of conservation work with that money. So the profits from our timber sales get invested back into the land, which is great. Yeah. In the back, let's get a couple out of the back.
would you recommend this strategy for Southeast Michigan, or would the invasive issue
If I'm being perfectly honest, the Southeast Michigan is a bit of a mystery to me. I drove down through Southeast Michigan and I saw a lot of woodlots and farm fields and a bunch of windmills north of here. I mean, there is a conservation strategy and there's lots of scientists at the Nature Conservancy that are working in Southeast Michigan. Invasive control is a huge thing. They're working a lot with agriculture and farmers to protect some of those warm water ecosystems. But that's a little bit outside of my world, so I don't think I can really speak to the work that the Conservancy is doing in Southeast. But I think that's where a large portion of the conservation practices that the Conservancy is doing is right here. Yeah.
How much revenue do you think you would realize from your reserves per year?
Per year?
Yeah.
Well, of course, it's entirely dependent on the timber markets. Right now, the type of forestry that we're doing yields, when we have a timber sale, about $250 to $300 per acre when we do a harvest. That number is relatively small per acre compared to what we could do, but it's because of the type of trees we're cutting and the type of work that we're doing improving those stands. So some of the discounted cash flow analyses and growth and yield, what happens over time is as we grow these forests, as these trees get bigger, they increase in value and all these things, and our silviculture is going to keep up with that, and our curve goes like this. So in time, we're actually, the return on our investment is going to be, it's going to be, 20 years, 30 years out, is actually really impressive. It's just that we need to give these forests time to grow and do the things ecologically. So the end game is that we want to prove that we've got a positive ecological benefit, but we can also protect your investment, and that's what we're working towards. Yeah.
I have a question. When you hit the brakes and Gino said, that
Yeah.
that tree.
He remembers that tree.
I assume that tree was alive.
Yeah, it was still alive.
So it's kind of a forestry question. How do trees live and for how long?
Well, it depends on the species. So jack pine that we were just talking about, 70 years, they die and they fall down. Aspen, birch, those are those early successional teenage trees. That's typical of those, is they're short-lived. In the mid-tolerance, in the late successional trees, the beech, the maple, the yellow birch, the white pine, those trees can live 250, 300, 400 years.
But it's hollow.
Even if they're hollow. Yeah, so the way a tree works is the only living tissue on a tree is just beneath the bark. All of the wood is dead cellular material. It's there for structure, but there's no biological process that takes place there. So they can be rotten as all rotten gets and live for 100 years. Yeah. Go ahead.
Yes, 64% of this country experienced catastrophic drought this year.
Yeah.
Do you foresee that as a threat to Michigan's forest?
Huge. And that's secondary to climate change. I think that's going to be one of our big things. So in the Arrowhead of Minnesota, I was just up in the Arrowhead of Minnesota a couple weeks ago. I don't know if you all heard about it down here, but in June, the Duluth, the Arrowhead, North Shore, Minnesota, had a 10.5-inch rainfall event. It blew out every culvert on Highway 61 between Duluth and Finland, Minnesota. It's unbelievable. And then they've had about half an inch of rain since. So that is, I think a lot of models will tell you, going to be typical of the kind of thing we're experiencing. These big flashy events and then these periods of drought. And I have never seen drought-stressed forests like I saw in the Arrowhead of Minnesota 2 weeks ago. The young, vigorous aspen, the tree that you couldn't kill if you wanted to, are standing there and they're wilted, and the new growth is all dead. The beech or the birch are dying. And another year or two of that, it'll have a massive change on that face of that forest. So yeah, it's a big concern. Yeah.
I recently heard someone talking about earthworms, I think in Washington.
Yeah.
Can you expand on
yes. So
what I'm not saying?
Yeah, earthworms are my new favorite thing that I'm learning about. I've recently, so we don't have a big earthworm problem in the UP yet. So earthworms are the evidence, what I've seen, so we manage a lot of land in northern Wisconsin and we have an earthworm problem. You say earthworms, right? I want earthworms in my garden. They do good things. They aerate the soil. They're castings in the nutrients. And you say, how is that a bad thing? Well, these earthworm colonies move into these forested stands. First of all, you got to think about a forested stand. The soil isn't very compacted because there's been, there hasn't been people rototilling it and doing all this stuff to it. So the earthworms actually compact the soil. The castings from the earthworm are actually denser, but what they do is they change the chemistry of that upper layer of the soil. They eat what we call the F layer, so that's the organic layer in the soil. They absolutely eat it. So what happens is you get these forested stands where if you kick this year's leaves off, it's mineral soil. There's no organic material there at all. So it has a massive effect on nutrient cycling. It has a really big impact on regeneration. So trees don't really want to regenerate in that environment. And another problem that we see is we call it carex. It's a sedge, Pennsylvania sedge. Absolutely loves that environment. So I can take you to forested stands in northern Wisconsin that are maple and beech and whatever, and they're standing over Pennsylvania sedge. And the combination of earthworms and then white-tailed deer have basically eliminated any regeneration in that forest. So without regeneration, we don't have our next generation of trees, and it's a massive management problem. And earthworms are a tough one. I'm just starting to learn about them. Yeah. Interestingly enough, if you want to know if you have earthworms, story. Gallon of water, 1/3 of a cup of powdered mustard. Mix it up, pour it on the ground. If you got earthworms, they're going to come shooting out of the ground. It's pretty good if you're a fisherman, too. So. Yeah.
So, with this climate change affecting forests, are you thinking differently about what types of trees to plant?
Yeah, I think about it all the time. Because we know that species are going to shift. And like, for example, I call them winners and losers. Right? Balsam fir, it's going to be a loser. It's on the southern extent of its native range. As things heat up, it's going to get driven north out of here. It's not going to make it. Problem is that things are going to change so fast, trees weren't going to be able to shift with it. So it's something that I think about, but here's what I think is going to happen. We're going to have refugia. So downwind from Lake Superior, we're going to have an area where climate change is going to take longer. It's not going to have as big an impact because of the moderating influence of the lake. There's a lot of other variables. So at this point, I'm not ready to start planting white oak in the UP because we think it's coming. We want to try to encourage a large, sweet, diverse native species so that we can better protect ourselves against the change that's coming. Again, the Straits of Mackinac are going to be a big problem. If you look at northern Wisconsin, and there's a lot of oaks and hickories and those southern species that will kind of migrate north into Wisconsin, the composition of the forest may change, but those species are there and they're going to move. When you think about species from lower Michigan making it to the UP, you're not going to be able to get a lawn chair and watch those trees walk across the bridge, right? I mean, so there's a real barrier there, and there's a lot of debate as to what's going to happen with that species shift. I think actually white pine is going to be a big winner, which is kind of interesting, because white pine in Michigan, I mean, that's our state tree, right? I mean, this state was covered in white pine. In a lot of climate change scenarios, white pine is actually a winner, so I'm pretty excited about that.
I'm surprised, white pine.
Yeah, white pine, yeah. It actually has a pretty big native range, and it can tolerate warmer temperatures at night, and it actually, most models show white pine being something that, at least short term, the next 100 years, is going to benefit. So the species are going to change, we know that, but the best thing we can do is make sure they're all there, right? If it's going to change to something that's not there, then we're in trouble. Yep, in the back.
Do you have any familiarity with the forest on Belle Isle in Detroit?
If I told you I didn't know where Belle Isle was, would that?
No, you don't.
Yeah, sorry. Anybody else? These are great questions. Anyone else? No? Oh,
Can you heat up trees, all the trees in Michigan, just by their bark in the winter?
at about 65 mile an hour. Yeah. That's, I mean, yeah, that's, yes. Unless it's like an ornamental, but most of the native stuff, yeah.
Speaking of ornamentals, how careful should we be as residents and landowners about what we plant on our property?
Yeah, so there are some species that are invasive that have been sold for a lot of years as ornamental stuff. I mean, the Soil Conservation Service used to sell stuff that we now call ornamental. So yeah, it's definitely something you need to think about. The DNR they published a fantastic book, and it's a color, nice glossy field book with all the invasive species in the state of Michigan, what their range is, kind of things you can do to try to limit their spread and identify them. And I mean, that's something that if you're curious about invasives, you should try to get your hands on. So when you are planting, you don't do that. I actually know people that have planted black locust in the UP as an ornamental. It's like, why? Don't do that. So, but anyway, yeah.
I heard that Chicago is planting their street trees. They're planting natives, but natives from like Kentucky and in the South, because they do live 100 years if it's healthy air.
Yeah,
Do you suggest that for like our yards?
Actually down in the southern part of Michigan, you're kind of right smack dab in the middle of the native range of a lot of species. So I think some of the species shift in the lower parts of the state, and like Indiana isn't going to be as dramatic as what it would be where we have those boreal species that are going to, that habitat's going north. So no, I mean, I personally don't recommend that at this point. I mean, we don't want to introduce a bunch of stuff that was not here because we think it's going to happen. We're not quite sure how this is going to shake out yet. But there are a lot of people that say, we should just start planting white oak. I mean, we should start planting hickory and, all this stuff. And I mean, it has its merit. It sure does. But I'm not ready to do that yet. So, yeah.
It was mentioned on here with the earthworms about the deer population. And I think a year ago there was a big talk about that. There was about what should be the maximum deer per square mile and the effects that the deer were having. Can you get any elaboration on that?
If you're only concerned about growing trees, there's too many deer in the state of Michigan. I mean, simply put, deer, particularly in the UP where they're migratory, they get away from the snow in the winter, they head south. If you get in those areas where the deer yard, I mean, it's almost impossible to grow a tree past, that height and get it to where it's gonna, be part of the future forest. So, I mean, deer population is a massive conversation. It's a political issue. It's all kinds of things. But, at the end of the day, I've been in a lot of areas where deer have had a devastating impact on forest regeneration. So it can be a problem for sure. Guys are working on it today, as a matter of fact, for us. It's funny. It was funny. Helen Taylor, the state director, said, can you come down on November 15th and give this presentation? And she said, it's deer season and all that. I'm like, are you kidding me? My office is full of people with guns. I'd love to come down and talk to you guys. So. They're working on it. Yeah. What's that? Yeah, they're doing it in Wisconsin. Yeah, that's a whole other issue. So, I see a few people are starting to filter out, so I'm probably, should we take that as a sign?
Thank you, John. Yes, that's good.
All right.
Thank you all for coming tonight. If you are interested in purchasing tickets for the next lecture, including January 24th, they're available at the front desk tonight, or you can always go online. Again, thanks for coming. We hope to see you again.